Hello, welcome to another live hangout of the DIP, the Destiny process. And today we're going to be having a very cool discussion on a topic that many people might be able to relate to. You've probably read the description, and we've entitled this after a long dissertation on how we could call this chat from avoidance to communication. And our guest is someone that people have walked with Destiny and the Destiny AI process probably know about from reading his blogs in the past years. He's Scott Cook. So, my dear friend and wonderful artist, yay! Welcome to the Hangout.
Thank you. Hello.
So, to begin with, it's very cool to also point out that the sheer point of coming to a hangout to share and open up, it's part of walking the same point of from avoidance of anything that has to do with cameras, computers, internet. This is a hangout in itself that has taken some time to bring forth. So I'm very glad that we are finally doing it. And how about we start? Oh, before we start, I'd like to remind our viewers that there's going to be questions and comments that you can place for Scott. So throughout the duration of this hangout, which is of about 40, probably more minutes, we have quite a few things to discuss, so feel free to place them. So Scott, first of all, can you share with us a little bit about yourself, of how were you or who were you before you made the decision of starting making some changes in your life? How could you describe yourself back then?
Well, as far as when I started, it was actually quite a while ago. I would put it more around maybe 15 years ago without necessarily knowing what I was doing. But I was always pretty uncommunicative and found it pretty easy to remain as sort of the passive spectator in the background and didn't really know necessarily how to participate in a lot of what passes for conversation. I might have had a perspective that I didn't necessarily know how to interject into the way the conversations typically go. And overall, I was just pretty, just always been this sort of introverted character for certain reasons that go back as, of course, as far as childhood. I have to say that I had parents who were, the only way they seemed to know how to communicate with each other was through constantly yelling and arguing. And I could tell even as a kid that it seemed like they were just arguing for the sake of it. They didn't really seem to know how to communicate any other way. And for any child, that's obviously really stressful. And my father was an alcoholic. He was drunk pretty much every night. And there were many times where he was very abusive in a way that wasn't necessarily a punishment. It was just his way of sort of practicing his drunken jujitsu on us kids, and without necessarily having any intention of teaching jujitsu, if you could call it jujitsu. It was just like basically just torturing us, and which I think a lot of people grow up tend to normalize when they look at it in perspective. But it's, when you look at it for what it is, it's pretty pathetic. And he was also very sarcastic. He was a sarcastic drunk. And my mother, on the other hand, was my Sunday school teacher. So this was like the perfect recipe for cognitive dissonance, where I didn't really know how to assert myself into any, saying what I perceive. It just didn't seem to fit in anywhere. There's that kind of inherent irrationality in all of that. So I may have been a relatively talkative child, but as I got a little older, I found that I could use silence as a form of manipulation. It's easy to just not respond to people because you're not giving them any feedback for their manipulation. So this became like a very long-term habit. and maybe different people would have different ways of responding to it. Mine was to sort of turn more inward and more closed off to other people, and just pretty much giving up on communicating in general.
So in terms of these, I mean, now that you've given the context of essentially how you grew up, what drove you to then at some point start getting yourself out of these patterns that you mentioned, like going into silence, avoidance? What drove you to seek for a change in your life? What triggered it within you?
It's hard to really pin it down, but there was always some kind of desire going back as far as 1999. That's when I first started writing down dreams. That was like my first attempt at writing out things that I'd experienced as they happened, just as a kind of creative writing exercise. And there are a lot of events that happened in between there that really gave me an interesting perspective on things. I actually kind of hesitate to mention. But I'll just say it. In 1999, same year I started Dreams, I tried to kill myself and ended up in, I guess what you would call a psychiatric hospital, place where I was diagnosed with depression and schizophrenia, which I would say I didn't have at the time. It was just like a really kind of extreme form of social anxiety that I was trying to overcome, but wasn't really succeeding back then. And through that experience, that was about the time that I just decided to spend more time with art and drawing and eventually painting, because it just seemed to be more in line with what I really wanted to do than, just the typical routine that's just set up for us of going to work and having just coasting along in this existence and living a very unsatisfying life and eventually dying. I wanted to do something creative, and that sequence of events was something that kind of, through reflecting on, got me more involved in what I wanted to do.
So before you arrived to the Destiny forums where we all met you and where you decided to start sharing yourself, you had been also writing. So how was your writing back then, and how did it change with time and with becoming more aware of this process of change, in essence?
I started attempting to write in a kind of stream of consciousness way, maybe in 2001 or 2002, right after my father died. It just became like a daily practice that I got into, that in retrospect, I didn't really know what I was trying to achieve other than to just like regurgitate stuff that was going on in my mind and put it down on paper. And I did that for about 10 years. In some ways it seems like a regrettable waste of time. However, looking back, maybe it needed to take as long as it did, because it's sort of similar to a lot of, the way people typically communicate out in the open, except it was just me with, my notebook, just putting down everything that was going through my mind without necessarily trying to bring it to any conclusion or, change anything necessarily. I guess I had the idea in my mind that through writing itself, I could eventually change within myself, but there's just the tendency to support old patterns and reinforce old self-image characteristics by just constantly propping them up in this way, and then they keep falling apart. So it's just like a continuous process, day by day, of holding this together, something that's unsustainable.
Holding in place all the characters and just reinforcing them and adding onto it. And it's like, I can definitely refer to that. I would also write a lot before starting this process, and it was all exactly what you meant. Like, reinforcing my personalities and adding a little bit to that and adding more drama here and there. And just for reference, we call it the gloomy self-experience character. Because that's what it is, you know. You find also comfort in that kind of characterization of oneself. So how did your writing then change into actually seeing yourself and getting to this point of actually assisting yourself to change with it?
Well, that wasn't maybe until like fairly recently, 5 years ago, when I met you. But in the time that I had been writing that way, I did try some things like timelines for the sake of trying to look at your life in terms of how you've been participating in it, and certain events that seem like landmark things that in which you found yourself changing your perspective on how you interact with other people and so forth. But for the most part, it was, I would say, 5 years ago when I started. Uh, I was trying to find a way to sort of pinpoint things that were going through my mind and sort of dissect them, because it was something I wanted to do, and for the longest time I found it to be kind of elusive because it maybe required a little bit more discipline than writing the way that I had, and a little more effort as far as like asserting myself to make that extra effort to sort of dissect all these things that I kind of taken for granted as part of who I am. It's interesting that it has that kind of elusive quality to it, I think, because people just aren't in the habit of talking about things like this, as it pertains to self-image and your participation in life and the world in general. So I would say 5 years ago, beginning with our first awkward conversations where you're the one doing all the talking and so forth.
Yeah, it was actually quite a process, and that's why we entitled this conversation like this, because it was a point wherein, through reading Scott's writings, I would be able to recognize a lot of that within myself. So I said, hey, I would like to get to know him better, like get to see what he's all about. And so we started a conversation through actually, phone calls. And in the first conversation, he barely spoke a word. I spoke for half an hour or so. It was like a monologue of sorts. But it's also been quite a cool relationship, in essence, of developing this process of communication over time and getting to this point of opening up about all of these things that, as you were mentioning, people don't usually talk about. So it's also like another way of redefining what a relationship, friendship can be, in the sense of being willing to share with another that is also looking at themselves, to stand back and look at the characters that we're making of ourselves, be able to describe them, to many times laugh at it for what it is, and support each other in that sense, which is and has been very cool, I would say. So in terms of some patterns that you've described also at the beginning and that you continue to work with, let's start with looking at, for example, avoidance and what this is all about, as well as a desire for vindication. So can you share with us who you were back then and how has it been, or how are you working with it now?
I'm still working with it now, definitely. It's not as though I've completely resolved everything. It's just such built-in conditioning. But avoidance and vindication, it's easy to just avoid people in general when it seems like they're not necessarily talking about anything, or they're just kind of in certain patterns of their own that I, from my perspective, can't necessarily relate to. So it's just very easy to even come up with a reason to participate in that sort of conversation. But often, like, the perspective I have might be something that is, again, it would just seem seemingly random if I were to attempt to interject it into the conversation, and it might come across as like rude, because for that very reason of it being random. But vindication Anyone who's been abused can relate to that. And a desire to just hold other people responsible, even if it's in a very general, non-specific way, to anyone who reminds you of your own past experiences. It sort of goes beyond the original experiences themselves, and like how we just sort of follow through with that by becoming hooked on our own sort of self-abusive cycle, and then just not really knowing how to deal with that because of the elusive quality that it has. We tend to project it onto other people. So it's very easy, and has a very reflexive quality to it, as well as elusive, which makes it very easy to play out, but maybe not so easy as far as processing it.
So this also has led you to certain aspects of self-loathing, as also part of the points that you've written out before. So you mentioned how you tend to project this as well, not only to your immediate environment, but also in general in society. So can you share more about this point?
Self-loathing?
Yes.
It's interesting because I don't really experience that so much now. I think it was more in the past, but as I get older, it's like I have become more used to the sound of my own voice and the way I look in pictures and stuff like that. It's interesting because looking at it now, it's not quite something I experienced as like a hindrance to communication in the way that I have in the past, but that the avoidance aspect of whatever comes with self-loathing, I think when I've noticed how it's such a common thing, that in itself has made it easier for me to, to a large extent, abandon it. Because when it's played out on such a grand scale, it kind of, and you understand that it sort of neutralizes whatever attachment you had to that particular thing, if that makes sense.
I kind of relate to that, specifically when being in a certain mindset of, in a way, opposing what is like common to everyone else. And in a way, one generates this kind of, maybe for the sake of shock toward others, to develop these certain traits or ways, like a self-image point, to also stand as a point of sometimes superiority, false sense of empowerment toward others. And when that point that you took as a stand becomes more common in others, it's like it loses its value. So it's also cool to reflect on why would one become that? Is it because I really felt it that way, or because I wanted to stand different to others or create some kind of shock? I don't know. There can be many reasons, but I definitely remember, like from the first writings, how you discuss a lot about this self-image point. And it's been very cool to also see how that is, as you say, a thing of the past, which is the whole point of recognizing change. Like, hey, I really cannot relate to that any longer. So there's also like a lot of the social and cultural conditioning. How did this affect you, or how did this influence in the past, the idea of how you should look and things like that? Can you share on that?
Again, it seems like such a long time ago, and as far as how I should look and how I should act, I guess my relationship to that was, I always had like a desire to connect with other people. That was always there, and I just felt like whatever I was sort of adopting or trying to integrate within myself as characteristics that I wanted to sort of make myself as a character was, in a pretty indirect, manipulative way, trying to go about connecting with people in that more direct way, but through that process of like trying to modify yourself to behave or look a certain way, it's pretty obvious that you're never quite getting there. If what you want is to just be able to connect with people, the most basic level of just human experience, it's hard to, there's too much to go into with that question. I think I don't even know where to start.
It's okay. We have other stuff to go through. So let's go into the next point that also you wrote about quite very openly, and many people can relate as well to, which is self-cutting. Have you realized what motivated you to do it? And have you stopped it? What made you decide to do so? Can you share?
I think I started like back in 1990 or so, because I'm really that old. I started when I was maybe 12 or 13. Nobody was doing it at the time, so it didn't have like the certain stigma, I guess, that it has today. Whatever memes that are going around that I don't know about because I don't really follow them. But for me, I found that it was a way of sort of, at the time I'd experienced myself as a self-image as something vulnerable, and I guess perceived myself as this sort of wounded animal based on like whatever I was dealing with at the time. And the intention was to sort of short circuit that whole self-image and the idea that I had of myself in relation to other people, and the cultural, social filters that they're all perceiving each other through, particularly at school, because kids are mean to each other on a regular basis. That's how they're conditioned. And so for me, it was because I always had this big insecurity about who I was and as an image in relation to other self-images, and I didn't really have like a group of people that I hung out with or anything like that. So it was like this attempt to sort of basically scarify or mutilate that self-image, so that the people in this environment wouldn't know what to make of it, and it would sort of short circuit whatever projections they had going, which I can say in retrospect kind of worked. I don't know how it works now for people though, because I didn't know that people were doing this back then. As far as I was concerned, it was just me. If other people were doing it, they kept it, covered up or whatever. But it's interesting if you compare it to something like alcoholism, which is perceived as more socially acceptable, of course. It's interesting to compare the two. Self-cutting or mutilation or whatever has a certain, I guess, neurotic stigma to it, like the person who's doing it is basically crazy or has something seriously wrong with them. But if you compare it to things like obesity or alcoholism or video game addiction or something, how do you decide which is worse? Because one is more on the surface and the others are, just very widely accepted as a way of dealing with whatever you want to deal with, and finding like a group of people who are all into the same thing and sort of enabling each other's behavior and escapism into whatever that is.
I would say that also this perspective that you shared enabled me to make sense of it, because I was definitely, as you were sharing about it, like wanting to find out, like, why would someone do that to themselves? But it is true. There are so many forms of self-abuse that we don't regard as, oh, it's so shocking, it's so unacceptable, just because we don't see the blood, for example. But alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual addiction, any form of addiction, any form of thing that you overdo as a point of harm upon yourself, it's of course equal to that. The only thing is that you decided to make it something very visible in your body, with also certain outcomes in terms of what you just explained. But it's definitely cool to always have this perspective, to not judge it immediately as, oh, people must be crazy because they're doing that onto their bodies, only to understand it and then see, okay, of course it's a point of self-abuse. I'm sure that the body doesn't like it, but it's not to see it any different to what many other forms of abuse also are. So you've completely stopped it, or what's your relationship to it currently?
Yeah, it's funny because you know how it is. I thought of this analogy for a while now, but like if you're into a band that seems underground and nobody else around you knows of them, and then suddenly they become popular and then you lose interest because they're no longer your band. That's pretty much why I stopped.
But that's the same thing that I was mentioning earlier, that we become these things because they were shocking at some point. I can definitely relate to that. And if someone else does it, it's like, why should I do it any longer, right?
Yeah,
So
pretty much.
it's like a counterculture aspect, that it's a topic in itself. But today, let's go into other discussions with you. The next point, it's about one of those things that marked you, and that's the abuse that you went through in the relationship with your father specifically. So there are specific memories that you can recall, of course, and that has triggered a lot of contempt, anger, sadness maybe about it. So what's your relationship in specific with your father, or the memory of him at this moment? Can you share about it?
It's interesting because he died coincidentally after September 11th, 2001. So at the time, I remember I was very relieved because I no longer have to, I guess, live in the same world with him, even though I'm sure there are people who are much worse all over the place. But just, I remember at the time I felt kind of optimistic because there was that sense of relief. And so I sort of, when I look back at that, I perceive it as like a time where I was very optimistic about where I was in life and what I was creating. And over time, I can see that it was that kind of optimism is about as, I don't know, not really anything that you can, I don't know, if it were pessimism, it wouldn't have made any difference. It seems fair to just put it that way. But over the years, I've noticed that when you really take the time to process things that have been done onto you in the past that you've sort of gone on to become, that you've sort of gone on to condition yourself to certain patterns of behavior, and you realize that if this person hadn't done these things onto you in the past, then you wouldn't have all these problems. If, for example, you had somebody who stood as an actual mentor in your life. And so, of course, there has been a lot of resentment that comes with that. And it's just interesting because it's when you can see it for what it is, that resentment, it's just like a ghost basically in the mind. That ghost, including just like everything that all your reactions and everything that you just churn up whenever you consider these things. But in retrospect, I can also say that if I hadn't had these experiences, if it hasn't, I don't know if I would have gained the perspective I have. So in a sense, I've kind of learned to appreciate the process that I've gone through as far as like reflecting on these things and growing to appreciate the perspective I've gained through, the duration of the time that it's that I've taken up to this point to process these events. It's the best way I can articulate it.
I mean, something that we've discussed as well is how within this sense of vindication that you've also explained before, how it kind of makes you realize that the person that did that upon you is now dead. Like there's no point of even now keeping or holding anything to them. But at the same time, how whether they were alive or dead, it really makes no difference, because it is oneself, that invariably keeps bringing up the same memories. It's like a form of self-torture in a way, when the moment that you are here right now has nothing of abuse, and one keeps, as you were mentioning, regurgitating the same memories and creating this sense of powerlessness that makes you want to be then more powerful, or vindication and taking revenge and things like these, which in the end kind of consume you. So I mean, many people can go through these kind of situations, and what would you suggest to them if they are still holding on to blaming, specifically blaming them for whatever they did or didn't do toward them? What's your, or if you ever experienced blame as well, how did you relate to it, and what would you say about this?
Well, it's very reflexive, and it seems like it's something that it's not only elusive, but also very hard to contain. Like it's a kind of energy that you don't really know what to do with. And, you can attempt to process it physically through work or exercise or running around in the woods or whatever. It's like, for me, it's always been like something that I took on as factoring into my own cultural filters and perception of the way that I perceive other people. I'd say that it's hard to say for anyone else or suggest what somebody else should do in my place. I can only say that, like, if you take the time to process your reactions to things in such a way where you're not just reinforcing the same kind of ideology that you're creating as far as how you store up these prejudices and continue to walk around with them, but to keep them in context. Because what would be the logical conclusion of spending your life carrying around these prejudices? Because it doesn't really go anywhere. There's probably more to say about it. I'll leave it to you to keep the conversation going.
I can fully agree on that aspect of there's no point really in blame, because either whether you're blaming yourself or blaming another, reality keeps moving. And if we only get stuck into that, for example, in many cases, to that childhood moment and keep every day revamping the same thing, it's like, well, where do you decide to be? Do you decide to remain in the past and remaining in that form of mental self-abuse, regurgitating the memories, blaming, instead of taking responsibility for yourself? So before we go into discussing more of the points that you've walked in terms of taking this process of stopping all of these patterns, there's also another point that has been kind of interesting in the context of contempt and revenge. There is a point of wanting others to suffer as much as they made you suffer. So what drove you to think this way? And how has this changed in your current life? Have you overcome it completely? Can you share?
Again, it's just like a really general projection toward nobody in particular. It's the same thing as like the filters that everybody else has in some form or another. A lot of people, again, have been abused in some form or another, so there's a tendency to sort of put up your guard against people. Some people will sort of, in this sort of crossfire of projections that people have, there's a tendency to get a little bit paranoid within all that. And so vindication is just like a certain kind of energy that we can like churn up every day and hold it against everybody to attempt to neutralize whatever they're projecting, if that makes sense. Because there's always been, for me anyway, like no desire whatsoever to participate in the prejudices, stereotypes that people carry around with them. My prejudice has always been just against the prejudices that other people hold. Because no matter who you are in the world, somebody will hold something against you. All you have to do really is exist. And based on whatever limited information they can gather from their image of you and how you project yourself, you're going to fall into some category that, you would prefer to have nothing to do with. So avoidance and vindication kind of go hand in hand, as well as just like the mental habit of cynicism, which I can relate to an extent, not in the way of like trying to necessarily go online and tell everybody what you think of them in some kind of flat, ironic, dry humor sort of way, which is very common. But in general, just that vindication, desire to sort of hold everybody accountable even away. And I've even noticed this when some of my cats have died in the past. Part of my grieving process has been just like, in a very indirect way, just blaming nobody in particular. It's kind of ridiculous, but again, when you see how it's something that so many people participate in, it makes it easier to recognize it for what it is within yourself, so that you're not just participating in the same thing, like churning up the same sort of prefabricated kind of foosball systems that everyone else tends to get caught up in.
Yeah, I can fully understand that. And I was actually seeing the same image, like passing the ball from one to another in terms of judgment, and how we're also used to keeping us in these cages of this is that and you are that. And if you do that to me, then I do it back to you. And that is precisely what needs to be stopped in this world, to, for once, instead of just directing a certain idea onto another, a certain judgment, rather have the guts to go and get to know the person, meet them, actually communicate, and stop holding on to these very limited ideas of ourselves. So I fully agree that stopping that is necessary as well. And at the same time, I would suggest the ability to forgive whoever has done something to you, to rather understand the context of why that person did it, because that usually, at least in my case and in with many people that I've also been talking to and working with, is one of the things that enables us to let go. When you understand the context of that person, why they did it, and how it was most of the times just the repetition of patterns throughout generations, and it needs to be stopped somewhere, and that's where we are here.
Mhm.
So about the point of communication now, which is getting to this point of actually deciding to open up yourself and start communicating. In this case, we have like what we can call a supportive relationship, wherein, as we mentioned the first call story. So how do you see this point of deciding to open up, to communicate, to share yourself through writings to whoever had access or has access to your blog? How has this been supportive for you?
It's actually refreshing in a sense to get these things out of your head, and once you do, you sort of realize that there was nothing to be so defensive about in the first place, because we do have a tendency to be kind of defensive about the things that are going on in our mind, and these sort of, prejudices, mind constructs, whatever it is we have, that are, as they are what our self-image is composed of, that we hold so dear as the characters that we imagine ourselves to be. So just when you consider what a lot of relationships are based on, it's like a desire for acceptance seems to be at the root of what they are, as opposed to like perhaps a desire to just connect with another person. And through that, I mean, it sort of neutralizes a lot of insecurities that you might have had about yourself in relation to other people. And it's a good place to begin. Like if you can find somebody, some people that you can talk to, where it's not just like the same subjects of communication. Like where I live, it's either the football team or the neighbors or people you know that you work with, or how much you hate your job, something you saw on television. Just relating about your own experience of yourself in this life, and the fact that you've been here however many years. And if you can relate to people on that level, it makes life a lot more satisfying. Whereas like I noticed in the past, certain relationships to people that were admittedly based on acceptance, there's just always that nagging sense of unfulfillment. Like every time you interact with them, everything is on the surface, and there are always things that could be said that are left unsaid. And there are always, like the way that I perceived it, always things that they said where I found myself just sitting, listening to them, and I didn't really even know what to say in response, other than that it seems like a very one-sided conversation. But that's just my experience. But it's much more satisfying if you can connect with somebody on a real, reality-based level.
I would also say, I've had people that, for example, are looking for a relationship. Oh, sorry for the noise, but whether it is a friendship relationship or partnership relationship. A lot of relationships that I had, including currently my partner, are made through the internet. And it all started with communication. So I can definitely agree with what you mentioned, specifically when you have a particular, let's say, platform from which to take on that conversation. For many people, it can start through certain things that they like. In our case, we kind of liked similar things in terms of art, certain music, stuff like that. But that invariably led us to start also digging further into the mind, and within this context of having a supportive conversation and opening up a lot of memories and ideas and imaginations and things that we have about our lives, and through that communication process getting to create this certain comfort in just sharing with another, learning from another. And I fully agree that it's also part of the very satisfying aspects in life. I mean, to me, the fact that you can be here and sharing with, here, it's like great, because I wouldn't have thought of that 5 years ago when you barely spoke a word. So that kind of thing is like, it can be done. And that's why it's so important that you share about it here. So thanks for that as well. And another point that you're walking at the moment is, I mean, for those that don't know, you are an artist, but at the same time, you have a regular job wherein you have to, of course, make money to make a living. So many get discouraged in terms of having to be doing a regular job to do this. What's your relationship currently with your work, and what's your take on this point?
Well, I can't really relate to why people would be discouraged. I've been disappointed many times, but never really discouraged, because creating just, to me, seems like a pretty inherent part of who we are, being creative in some form or another. I've been, I guess the point in relation to where I work right now is mostly just that of pressure in terms of like the amount of time that I have, because I have something that I'm trying to accomplish right now, and it's really just a matter of like finding the time to do it. And it seems like once I'm getting into it, I have to put it all aside because I have to go to my job. And I don't expect that to last, too much longer. I think most people honestly don't like their jobs. The tendency is to just sit around and complain about every little aspect of the job, which is what we in general tend to hear on a regular basis. But if instead of complaining, you actually use the time that you have to create something of your own, then obviously eventually you don't have to work at jobs like that anymore. That's like the ideal that we can all strive toward. If, provided you have the basic necessities in place to kind of support yourself along the way.
Okay, so to our viewers, I'd like to remind that you can still place any comments, questions for Scott. We are going into the last part of the Hangout. So tell us in general, what have been the benefits of you having made that decision, as you mentioned, around 5 years ago, to make some changes in your life and step outside of what we call the doom and gloom and gloomy self-experience mindset that many of us go through in our lives in one way or another. And step out of these characters. Like, what have you discovered of yourself? What has emerged out of you?
Well, over time, basic insecurities have just kind of frizzled out to a large extent. There are still like certain reflexive insecurities that I still have. Like this event is a good example. There's a tendency to be, kind of tense whenever I'm sort of put on the spot to explain myself. But aside from that, I've just found it much easier in general to interact with people, and leaving aside any concern that I might be misunderstood. It's definitely something I'm improving at. Just my relationships in general, people I've been friends with for a while, I think that, I've heard them tell me that I've become a much better communicator over the past 5 years, or whatever it is. So it's, I guess you can say, a pretty fundamental survival skill to be able to communicate. It's a good thing to cultivate. And I never really thought that I would be able to find it within myself to do that. But of course, it's been just like anything that's dormant that really just needs to be awakened. I continuously find myself in situations where I'm sort of confronted with the reality that I'm not allowing myself to exercise this part of my brain, the social part of my brain, where I can just interact with people, because it's still, I find myself in this pattern of occasionally not knowing how to participate in whatever's going on if there's like a room full of people. But definitely much improved upon it a lot in the past 5 years. More so than like throughout any other point in time in my life. So
Yeah, to me, it's been awesome to also kind of be witnessing this process through our communication and how have you been dealing with your personal life as well, and continuing to be creative after all as well. As a last point, I'd like to ask you about self-judgment, because this was also one of the main points that you would usually write about. So in a very brief manner, how can you describe your relationship currently with self-judgment, and what can you share on it?
Very briefly, it's not to the extent it was before. The way that I guess I judge myself now is mostly in terms of how much I can accomplish in the course of a day. So that's pretty much, you know, for the most part, that's pretty much it.
Well, something that I would like to share that I said I would share in terms of what I've learned from you, and just getting to know you. You mentioned patience, in terms of having been patient with you from the very first moments of communicating and not really knowing how to follow through a conversation. And sometimes this can be awkward, and it's normal. We have to make peace with considering where a person has been, in terms of you not having been like the social butterfly ever in your life. Things like that, which I had to learn to also understand that, and slowly but surely be able to develop something, which takes time. And this also reveals that any process of change is not immediate, nor does it happen with you being alone in your room. Like, you've moved yourself, you've been out there working, you have other friends, you maybe not many uh, situations of social activities, but you do visit people and things like that. um, and also in relation to being very stable by yourself, in terms of not really being craving a relationship as in a partnership relationship. This is something that I've also kind of admired of you, like being so well without it. The discipline that you have for running, for example, it has inspired me to start doing it as well. And other stuff. I mean, this is the kind of relationships that I would just recommend to anyone having as a friendship. Um, to find someone that you can talk to, that you can support each other, not to reinforce the same characters, but to actually learn to discuss them, open them up, laugh about it all, and then be able to, with time, witness, okay, how have we changed, and what are we currently experiencing? And this hangout is certainly not to say, oh, he's done or he's transcended it all. You keep working at it, but we keep discussing on it and opening it up. So thanks a lot for sharing yourself, and for not giving up on life, because you certainly, as you said, you tried to commit suicide. So thanks for keeping at it, and also being quite an inspiration in terms of art. So we have a question from Dushka. She's saying, hey Scott, it's awesome to meet the guy behind amazing artworks. Thanks for sharing yourself.
Thank you.
Something that I've mentioned to Scott many times is that he places his artwork on his Facebook. I'll place it in the link to this discussion, and his blogspot, of course, and website. And it's cool that people leave feedback. And now I will place it here, that it would be cool if you reply as well, to kind of create relationships with people that way, because art is already quite a clear point that can be discussed upon, given feedback upon. So definitely keep at it, in terms of considering replying to people. That would be a very cool opening as well.
Yeah, definitely.
We have one from Ibrahim Diek, saying, hello, I have been living in Finland for a temporary education, but I feel a little depressed and I have been avoiding the school for more than 3 weeks. How can I fix this? What would you say to that, Scott?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I find it easier to respond to if I could talk to you in person, but I can definitely relate to depression and not wanting anything to do with that particular environment. For me, over time, it's just been a matter of finding it within myself to confront that aspect of myself, because the first place that you can begin to confront it is within yourself, instead of just seeing this environment as something forever separate and detached from who you are, because it's in the world. So it's just consider it perhaps a way of testing yourself. And through that, you can probably begin to, find yourself improving, or, becoming stronger in a way that you may not necessarily have thought you had within yourself. So I hope that's a sufficient answer.
Yeah, I like the idea of making it almost like a challenging situation that in the end, whether you decided to be there or not, that you're now walking through it. So avoiding it is more like procrastinating getting to something that you know inevitably you will have to face anyway, one way or another. So why not finding out other ways to relate to that? I mean, I understand that school can be a certain thing in itself, but if you know that you will eventually have to go through it, why kind of piling up the process of just walking through it? I mean, Scott, you were in art school actually. You did walk the whole thing. So did I.
I can't believe that we've talked this entire time without me bringing that up, but
Yeah, exactly.
now we did, so it's out
So,
there.
so you did manage to go through it, and you probably had the same experiences at times, or did you?
Yeah, it's funny that we bring that up, because it was for precisely that reason. I can honestly say I had no desire to get a degree, because even when I started, I recognized the uselessness of a degree in art. It was mostly like something that I felt was a way to test myself. Something I felt like I needed to put myself in that kind of environment. Although now I think probably better ways to do it, but at the same time, there's nothing to regret, because I've developed relationships through that process that I couldn't have developed any other way, and we've remained friends for a very long time, and they're gonna see this and know what I'm talking about. And,
Absolutely. I
and
agree with that as well in terms of the relationships form. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm grateful to them as well as I'm grateful to you.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, I would also go for it in terms of, I also started seeing going through school, specifically also art school, like, okay, just do it because you have to do it. You have to go through the whole thing and finish what I started. And in the same time, rather enjoy the being around people. That's also what I can take from it, and the relationships formed there. So see it for the more constructive side of it, instead of kind of rehashing or regurgitating the same thoughts that lead you to not wanting to go there. So plus Finland seems to be quite a great country, so enjoy
Yeah.
if you can. So thank you very much, Scott. If you want to add anything else, let me know now.
I just want to say you got a chance to say what you learned from me. And what I've learned from you above all is mostly just like in terms of qualities that I would like to cultivate for myself, that I've always been even somewhat jealous of you for. I think a lot of people would be, because you're really good at doing what you do. But I'm, just getting past the hesitation of this idea that what you have to say doesn't really matter or necessarily fit into the way conversations typically go. You have a certain perspective of the world based on your own experience. And, for one thing, being able to communicate in the way that we are, to sort of reflect off one another and sort of test our perspective on things and our prejudices, it does enable you to validate your experience and the perspectives that you've gained, while sort of weeding out the prejudices that you've sort of picked up along the way. So basically just being so bold as to assert yourself into what seems like a constant narrative that doesn't necessarily seem to have any point to it, so to speak.
Yeah, like giving yourself some space, even if it seems that there's none where you could fit in, and say, well, this is who I am. I'm here. I share what I see. That's it. You know, having no particular intent toward it, but just like expressing who you are and your intent and what kind of principles that you have, how you see life on Earth, the topics that you're interested on. And yeah, I agree that that is a cool thing to definitely cultivate and continue cultivating wherever we are. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
So guys, this is the end of the Hangout. I want to thank very much Scott for finally making it. And we made it through the whole conversation, and thanks to you, the viewer. And there will be some other Hangouts to come, so keep an eye on this channel's schedule. See you next time. Bye, Scott.
Bye. Thank you.